It is my great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce Christopher Isike to you. Professor Isike is a professor of African politics and international relations at University of Pretoria. He is the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States, and he is president of the African Association of Political Science. Now, as for his profile, Professor Isike conducts research from an Africanist lens and teaches international relations theory, strategic and security studies, and security theory at the University of Pretoria. His research covers African soft power politics, women, peace and conflict studies, women and political representation in Africa, rethinking state formation in Africa, politics in a digital era, and African immigration to South Africa. Professor Isike has over 60 publications in top national and international peer-reviewed journals. He is editor-in-chief of Africa's foremost political science journal, Politicon, South African Journal of Political Studies. And since 2017, he has been editor of Ubuntu, Journal of Conflict and Social Transformation. He also serves on the editorial board of several reputable international journals, such as International Political Science Abstracts. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure for me to give you Professor Isike, and his topic will be Africa's soft power values, resources, and impact. Professor Isike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicoletta Osho, for your introductions. Thank you to everyone. Good evening in Africa. I guess it's evening in the United Kingdom and much of Europe. And then greetings wherever else you are in the world. I know there are people here from the United States, so I guess it will be good afternoon. I've got only 15 minutes, so I want to maximize that as much as possible. So I'll go straight into it. So let me start by saying that first, since Joseph Nye coined the term in the 1990s, the concept of soft power has become a buzzword among foreign policymakers, diplomats, scholars, journalists, protocol practitioners, and keen observers of international relations across the world. So I know many of you here know what soft power means, so I won't really give any detailed or academic definition of the concept, but essentially it is the ability to make others do what one wants them to do without the use of force, right? So for Joseph Nye, for example, it entails the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion, or what he calls payment, as well as the ability, to affect others or make them to obtain the outcome one wants through attraction rather than coercion or payment. So Joseph Nye argues that soft power is essentially premised on the power of attractive ideas, all right, or the ability to set the political agenda and determine the framework of debate in a way that shapes the preferences of others, right? So in essence, a soft power is the power of attraction that leads the country with attractive soft power resources, to have more influence over the one that is attracted by those resources, right? So therefore, countries then mobilize, this non-physical, abstract, subjective, if you like, and often subtle attribute of soft power in 3 dimensions, which according to Nye include culture in places where it is attractive to others, political values when it lives up to, when those countries live up to these values both home and abroad, and we shall talk about this when we look at our case studies just now, as well as foreign policies when they are seen to be legitimate and having moral authority. So in this sense, culture refers to the values, norms, and practices that give meaning to a society in form such as literature, art, music, entertainment, tourism, hospitality, popular media, as well as indigenous products. So countries can use a number of of sources, to project these forms of soft power, which then become assets, that produce attraction. And our soft power is centered on resources, therefore, such as the culture of a nation, its norms and values, and its foreign policy in a nutshell. So a state is able to become more attractive, more persuasive, and influential in the international system through mobilizing its soft power resources without having to force or intimidate other states to accept its preferences. Now, more recently, there has been increasing evidence of the recognition of the value of soft power as an essential component of power status. And it is also passing the measurability test, which previously was seen to be one of the biggest challenges of soft power. So countries are also beginning to pay closer attention to the intricacies of culture, political ideology, and diplomacy as a subtle weapon in changing the international relations landscape. And I think that protocol is also going to play a very major role. It's already playing a major role in that. So big powers such as the United States, China, as well as middle powers like Canada, Australia, do not deny the potency of soft power instruments in building a positive image for themselves in world affairs, because it enables them to generate greater levels of respect and admiration from other nations. So coming back to Africa, the question then remains, where does Africa fit in all of these, and what are its soft power values, if it has any? I also want to be dealing with questions of Africa's soft power resources, and then end with the question of the impact that these soft power resources make. And then we can, during the question and answer session, go into the role that protocol has to play in all of this. So for me, in the light of the increasing relevance of soft power, like I just highlighted in international politics, two major institutions have emerged to develop, indices and set indicators to measure them, right? Now, these are the soft power 30 by Portland, and then the Global Soft Power Index by Brand Finance. The soft power 30 is not comprehensive, as it only focuses on 30 states, as the name implies. And most of these 30 states, in fact, all of them are Western countries, and there is no African representation, okay? Now, on the other hand, the Global Soft Power Index highlights the soft power of 60 states or 60 nations with indicators, and it features 4 African countries. These are South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria. So clearly, as with everything else in the world, Africa is still marginalized, even among the 60 when it is mentioned, right? However, this marginality is not my focus tonight, as we do have more than these 4 countries with significant soft power values in the continent. And if you ask me, apart from these 4 that I mentioned, the list should include Rwanda, should include Kenya, should include Ethiopia. But let's leave all of that. The question is whether Africa has its own, philosophic understanding and use of the concept of soft power. This is important for us to be able to know where our protocols, our diplomacy comes from, where it is and where it should be going. So I will focus on the works of one of Africa's top soft power scholars, Oluwaseun Tella, who attempted to de-Americanize the soft power concept by analyzing the BRICS countries' soft power, whose resources do not exactly fit, into Joseph Nye's initial conceptualization that I talked about earlier. Especially when you look at countries like China and Russia. Now, in his book, which is actually the first scholarly book on Africa's soft power, Taylor argues that these non-Western states have successfully wielded their soft power to achieve some of their foreign policy objectives, and then goes on to engage the soft power attributes of the African case studies that are not captured in Joseph Naire's original ideas of the concept of soft power. Now when I zero in on the African examples that Taylor uses, he talked about Nigeria's Omoluabi, South Africa's Ubuntu, which I had written on earlier in 2020. He talks about Kenya's Harambee, and then Egypt's Pharaonism, right? So if you take them one after the other, on Nigeria, the book outlines the sources of the country's soft power that stems from its philosophy of Omoluabi, which, though rooted in Yoruba definition of good personhood, defines the general Nigerian spirit of, self-discipline, self-reliance, trust, tolerance, humility, selfless service to humanity, respect, courage, equity, and diligence in public and private dealings. These are attributes that define the Nigerian person in general. Of course, we know that there are many Nigerians that are known to not have a lot of these, just like every country. But in general terms, these are definitive characteristics of the Nigerian personhood, which is represented in this philosophy of Omoluabi. And of course, you agree with me that all of these personality traits I mentioned are useful in effective protocol making, right, and practice. Now, Nigeria's soft power includes its cultural exports in the form of Nollywood, its Afrobeats music, its diaspora population, its literature, its policies of democracy promotion, peacemaking, and aid giving, which finds expression, for example, in the technical aids core scheme. Now, so the gains that Nigeria has reaped from its soft power posture and resources include economic ones, the internationalization of its culture, which is provided by Nollywood and its Afrobeat music, its successful promotion of democracy across the continent, its recognition as a major peacemaker on the continent. All of these are some of the gains that Nigeria has gained from the projection of its soft power, even though it doesn't do this, very consciously. And despite these gains, Nigeria has not significantly exercised its soft power, like I said, to achieve its foreign policy objective due to a number of domestic and external constraints, including corruption, insecurity, and the image problem that I mentioned earlier on. So if you go to South Africa, the philosophy of Ubuntu, as a ground norm of the country's soft power foreign policy characterized by a worldview of human interconnectedness, is well documented, and this resonates with your motto of global connectedness, that you highlighted just now. So South Africa's soft power resources include its cultural outputs of soap operas, its universities. And by the way, I'm Nigerian, but I've been in South Africa now for 17 years. I came here as a PhD student and then grew and became a full professor eventually in one of the top universities in the country. It's a measure of South Africa's soft power resources in terms of higher education in Africa. So you can also mention the values of constitutionalism, its liberal democracy and human rights, and the foreign policies of peacemaking and democracy promotion, all of which forms Pretoria's soft power. Let me add that South Africa is arguably the most effective soft power state on the continent in terms of how it uses its soft power to achieve foreign policy and national objectives. It is more intentional than countries like Nigeria that doesn't even have the word soft power in its foreign policy. And we can see the evidence of South Africa's soft power benefits in terms of how it hosts, it has hosted international events and continues to host international events. We've seen how it hosted the FIFA World Cup. Protocol played a huge role in that as well. Its role as Africa's representative in key international institutions such as the BRICS and G20, right? So let me leave that and go to that of Egypt. I will not leave South Africa without also talking about some of the challenges it has in terms of its double standards of human rights, and of course the perennial problem of Afrophobia, which continues to bedevil it. This subtracts a lot from its soft power, but then even at that, the gains from soft power diplomacy has been enormous to the country. You can look at Egypt's soft power philosophy, which is rooted in the history of great pharaohs, cultural symbols, towns, ideas, all of which define, pharaohism. And its soft power resources include, cultural exports in the form of its ancient civilizations, its entertainment industry and literature, its foreign policy of pan-Arabism, and its image as a stabilizer in the Middle East region. Okay, Egypt's soft power has also yielded positive returns, including its strategic partnership of, with the West in efforts to try and manage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and its image as a foremost Arab nation in the region. Like South Africa and Nigeria, it also has its challenges, which I will not have time to go into. But I also want to look at Kenya, which is my last case study, and talk about its soft power, which Etela argues is rooted in Kenya's philosophy and national motto of Harambee, right? Which, like Ubuntu, refers to the collective participation of individuals in a community to achieve said goals through pulling, community resources together. Now, Kenya's soft power resources include its cultural exports, including its fabric, the success of its athletes in international sporting events, its wildlife and tourist attraction, cultural festivals, and its idealistic and pacific foreign policy and economic diplomacy, which though has been tainted a bit by the activities of Al-Shabaab across the continent. Okay, but look, if I am to go now to the impact of Africa's soft power state, it is important to say, look, beyond having these resources, what impact have these states been able to use this to make for themselves and for the continent at large? Now, if you look at the fact that we are in a world where it become increasingly intersocial in structure, where weakness politics has been dominant over power politics, of course, until Russia's recent war in Ukraine. Africa has had an opportunity to leverage the soft power moment until now to attract some influence in establishing new human security norms that can change the game of international politics and possibly providing an opportunity for reforming the international system, right? So indeed, we have lived through a socio-political world increasingly defined by emerging issues that give meanings to the concept of power, all right? These issues, many of which are framed as human security vulnerabilities, including unconventional conflicts such as terrorism and epidemics such as Ebola, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, which was rightly described as a global war, could be regarded as critical junctions given how they are shaping the tenor of global politics, right? The end of the Cold War in 1991 presented new forms of conflict, mostly within states, which presented new security challenges that were correctly captured by critical security scholars as non-traditional security, and which required non-traditional approaches to understand and to resolve. Now, these security vulnerabilities were implicated as potential drivers of interstate conflicts, as we saw in much of Africa, insurgencies, guerrilla warfare, and of course, domestic terrorism. Now, many of them were spotted beyond national borders in ways that also show the interconnectedness. And the interconnectedness of these issues and the transnational threats necessarily imply new meanings of the concept of power and its use in the international system. So for someone like Bertrand Badi, a French international relations theorist, he underscored their implications for understanding power and its usage in an increasingly intersocial and connected world. And that's how we want to also understand the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought the world to a standstill in 2020. So clearly, in the new context of an intersocial world of new actors and new issues beyond the control of states, military power and missiles do not count for much.
Your entire family isn't dead, and they had a witness.
Am I out of time?
You have like 5 minutes.
All right, 5 minutes. I'll finish before 5 minutes. So I was saying that what we have seen is that measuring power in military status terms do not count for much, and political strategies, in the strategic terms as we've known them in the past, have lost much of their primacy. What we have instead are other forms of power that are less threatening and yet more compelling in influencing behavior of people across the world who are connected by issues that transcend national or state borders with implication for foreign policies of states. And these new forms of power, which soft power represents, are worth considering. So soft power does present that opportunity for Africa to punch above its weight. Because if you look at it carefully, even in the next, in the next 20 to 30 years, if Africa was to devote all of its resources, economic resources, into building, its militaries and its military arsenal, it will still not be able to compete with the major powers in the world. But Africa can compete in the soft power space, and it has the resources to be able to do so. So we do have an abundance of soft power resources and potentials, which we can appropriate to rack up global admiration and influence. And some of the countries I mentioned earlier are already doing this. So, for example, apart from countries like South Africa being in BRICS, which is an important economic and political bloc in world politics today, Egypt and Rwanda are showing that the world that Africa can solve problems. We've seen Egypt being a major player in the Middle East. We've seen Rwanda coming into the fore, sometimes, in a very dodgy manner, a controversial manner, but projecting themselves as problem solvers as well. Nigeria has also helped to promote democracy in much of West Africa, including Sierra Leone. I'm sure Ambassador will testify to that. And this is even though Nigeria has challenges with democracy at home, but it's the same way you can ask whether the United States has anything to teach us about democracy when it has a dysfunctional, legislature right now in the United States. They can only come together when there's war, for instance, as we saw in the case of the bipartisan vote that led to the act, the countering malign Russian activities in Russia act, which was passed recently, right? And you see, if you look at our youths in Africa, our youth population, which Patricia highlighted in her slides, which makes us the future economic hub of the world, and have been showcased by the achievements of young Nigerians in music and Nollywood, in IT in Rwanda, women empowerment and racial tolerance in South Africa, and the list goes on and on. Let me conclude in 2 minutes. The point is, I've highlighted what Africa, the potential African states have, to punch above its weight in an increasingly intersocial world where power is not defined by military might, but power is defined by ability to attract and connect with the rest of the world. And Africa has resources to do this. That's the point of this argument. So to conclude, although always silenced and neglected, by the racist international system, that profiles Africa as the basket and hopeless continent of the world, a good number of African states, as I've shown you, have impressive soft power resources, both the ones that are well developed and the potential, which can help it to rewrite its story and to punch above its weight in the Committee of Nations. However, I must say, the extent to which Africa will be able to counteract the global Afrophobia it suffers will depend on the degree to which the regional powers it has, such as Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, and other states like Angola, Ethiopia, Morocco, and Algeria, are able to harness their soft power capabilities to shape global perceptions of the continent. Therefore, it is imperative to build diplomacy and protocol in Africa around its soft power resources, soft power attributes, and the soft power potentials. Let me stop here and then, get more engaged in the discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Isike. It was a fantastic presentation, and we already have 2 questions if you are ready. Let me start with Julius Lambert, who actually said, what can be done to fully institutionalize soft power as a diplomatic policy in Nigeria in particular, and in Africa in general?
Right. So when I was speaking, I talked about countries like South Africa that have codified soft power in its national development plan. Okay, South Africa dedicates a chapter to international relations, and in that chapter, South Africa's foreign policy philosophy is rooted in Ubuntu. Okay, South Africa sees the world from an interconnectedness point of view, and this is how you see how South Africa tends to take the lead in representing Africa in major international forums like and economic groups like the BRICS, like I mentioned, like the G20, right? Countries like Nigeria, of course, like I said, have not paid sufficient attention to focusing on soft power as a way of leveraging the advantage, the recognition it already has in many quarters of the world. So to answer the question directly, what can be done to institutionalize is for the foreign policy makers, the different departments that are responsible for foreign policy making in Nigeria and different parts of the continent, to take stock of what they want to do as a nation or as a state. First of all, you must define yourself, and then you must take stock of what you are, what resources you have, and define for yourself the kind of world that you want to present, the kind of state that you picture you want to present to the rest of the world, to your neighbors, leveraging on, of course, your power attributes. And the point is that power is no longer defined by your military might. It's now more defined by, of course, your economic might is important, but by other cultural and political attributes that you can set to the world. For example, I've told people in the United States that South Africa, Kenya have something to teach the United States in terms of racial tolerance and integration, right? Because these 2 countries, especially South Africa, have been able to exhibit a high level of racial tolerance that the United States, in less than 30 years, that the United States have not been able to exhibit in over 200 years since the end of the Civil War. So what is it that South Africa is doing in terms of racial tolerance, in terms of racial integration? What has Kenya done in terms of racial integration that the United States, with its structural racism problems, can learn from these countries? And we can package, South Africa can package, Kenya can package these as models, examples of for the world to follow in terms of how to relate with one another across different places. So the bottom line is that we have to find ways to define who we are, identify what our strong points are, and then showcase those as a form of power attribute that can already give us leverage in the international system. Well, I was in the United States for 3 months last year, towards the end of last year, and I'm not kidding you. I went around 8 cities in 8 weeks. 8 cities in the United States in 8 weeks, and every time I took an Uber from the airport, all right, I asked the because I started noticing in my third city in Austin, in Texas. So I would tell the Uber driver to switch on the radio. And before I would get to my hotel, lo and behold, you hear Nigerian music on the airwaves of the radio in Texas. I went to Maryland, Baltimore, same thing. I went to Atlanta and Georgia, same thing. In Minnesota, Minneapolis, where I was hosted by the University of Minnesota, same thing. And it told me something about whether the Nigerian government was even aware that Nigerian music had permeated, you know, social-cultural life space in the US this much, all right? And that if they were aware, I was wondering what they could do with that music and the kind of leverage it could give them. What about the Nigerian diaspora in the United States? The Nigerian diaspora in the United States is the most educated diaspora in the world, all right? This is not information I'm just giving you. You can check it out in the US State Department. They are the ones who gave me that information, because when I was there, I was trying to make sense. I was trying to study Nigerian Americans. I was trying to understand how they are so educated and how much they contribute to the United States, and whether they could become soft power agents to Nigeria and also to the US, given that they have this dual citizenship. I can't begin to tell you the amazing things.
Professor Isike, we have to stop you there.
Right. The bottom line is that
because if we go on, we won't.
Thank you. I'll stop. Thank you.
But I'm sure we will get more from you. I'm sorry, we have to stop now. And I'm sure our participants will understand. But it's always very interesting, isn't it, when we have Professor Isike talk about soft power in Africa. And I just think we can't stop listening. So I'm sure we'll come back to you again at some point. Maybe we'll just do only soft power and you just let us know this, all that we require. So Nikki, back to you. I'm sorry to just jump in.
Yeah, Christopher, Isike, thank you so much for the presentation. And we do have some questions in the chat box. So I please kindly ask you to stay a little longer with us. And if you have time, if you can answer these questions for us in writing, because we do need to move on to the next speaker. But I could have listened to you for hours and and all night long even. It was really interesting, very knowledgeable, very informative. So thank you so much for that.